Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
So one of the top two things couples argue about is sex. And one of the major reasons I hear about why clients come to me is that they've become like roommates. Now, there's also increasing evidence that couples are having less sex than ever, and maybe that's you. And if you're the partner who wants more physical intimacy, this could be quite hurtful and frustrating. And if you're the partner with the lower libido, you might be wondering what the big deal is. Well, to answer that question and to address what can make your sex life better, I've invited my colleague, Jenée Palet, back on the show. She's an intimacy coach and the author of Living an Orgasmic Life, Heal Yourself and Awaken Your Pleasure. So, Jenée, thanks for coming back on and talking about what's a really important topic.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm super happy to be here. And, you know, I love talking about intimacy and sex, so.
Yeah, not just normal dinner time conversation, you know, and actually I think that's one of the problems is that, you know, we have this society that uses sex, advertising, all of this stuff. And so it seems like it's everywhere, but actually in people's bedrooms or even at the kitchen table, it's not there. So what's going on? And more importantly, maybe what's not going on in the bedroom these days?
Yeah, that's such a great point. Like, we really are totally schizophrenic. We're like this very, like, it's all about sex and sexy commercials and, you know, sex sells. And yet it's really hard for people to actually have real conversations around sex. So what's going on? Well, so many different things are going on and not going on at the same time.
Yeah, because I just asked you, like, okay, in 5 minutes, tell me the history of the world, right? You know, it's that kind of a question.
Right. In 5 minutes, like, the history of the world is that sex has always been a hot button topic for us as individuals, as a society. You know, there has always been, you know, since the 1700s, puritanical shame around sexuality, and we are not a free society when it comes to sex, especially in the United States and in some of the European countries as well. It varies, but that's really part of what's going on, is that we're not comfortable talking about sex because of all of the ways in which we've become conditioned to not talk about sex, to be told that sex is bad, sex is shameful, sex is something secret that you only do when you're married.
In the dark, in the dark, fully clothed, yeah.
In the dark, fully clothed, right? And it isn't dinner time conversation, and that is like such a huge part of the problem. Because we've made it this like secret thing that has a lot of like secrecy and shame and all sorts of negative connotations around it, it's not something that we're really comfortable talking about. And because we can't talk about it when there's a problem, it just literally gets, like, you know, stuck under the covers, or head goes in the sand. And, you know, when there's no communication, before you know it, all of a sudden things blow up, or you realize that, oh my God, we're roommates. We're not, you know, we're actually not lovers anymore. That our whole love life has really fallen apart. And it really stems from our inability to communicate, which stems from our discomfort with being able to talk about sex. And I know you see that. I mean, I see that with clients all the time. People tell me all the time, like, I've never talked to my partner about that, or we really have a hard time communicating around sex.
Right. And one of the rules of thumb, and I'm sure you do this too, is I tell people, don't talk about sex while you're having sex unless it's, oh, that feels really good, or ouch, ouch, that hurts. Because that's, I mean, you know, it's so hard. And again, there's also this thought, because we are animals, whether we like to admit it, that on some level sex is natural, so that if you need to talk about it, there's something wrong with you.
Right. I that is a good point. We hear that, I hear that a lot. And we are animals in some ways. I mean, deep down inside of us, there may be an animalistic sexual instinct, but it has been so suppressed that is one of the hardest things for people, especially women. I see that many men, not all, but some men have more access to that animal instinct. Mm-hmm. But for women especially, it is so deeply, deeply suppressed, again, because of the shame, like, oh, I'm not supposed to act like that. I'm not supposed to make those type of noises, that it doesn't become spontaneous. This whole sex is spontaneous kind of sex should be spontaneous kind of thing. It's bogus by and large.
Well, but isn't some of that, because again, this goes back to, when we're first with somebody, when that animal sexual attraction is at its zenith, it's at its height. It's like sex is, I'm not going to say it's always easy, but it seems to be a lot more natural, the kind of, and maybe, the rip your clothes off, just go at it, full force, seems to be the ideal, or it's like anything else about those in love feelings that, they are biologically driven, and they can't last. Just because we'd be exhausted all the time.
Right. And, and they're chemically induced in our brains, right? That, the new relationship energy actually releases a set of endorphins. If you, I can't remember the name of, I know it's Helen Fisher, but I can't remember the name of her book. Mm-hmm. Helen Fisher talks about, and other researchers have talked about, like, literally there are endorphins that are released, hormones that are released in our body in the beginning of a relationship, because Mother Nature really wants us to procreate.
Yes.
And that's, a little bit of, it's wonderful and it's juicy and it creates connection. And it can't possibly last, because you're right, we would be exhausted. And the endorphins just die down after a period of time. And so, that initial like surge in new relationship energy, when everybody is kind of like ripping their clothes off, is not sustainable. And usually also it's not really that, there's not a lot of deep connection and intimacy there. It's really more of a physical attraction and connection, and the deepening of the relationship really happens over time.
So that brings me to this question, and I think why intimacy sex presents a problem in many relationships is, because it's like, what is the big deal about sex? Why does being intimate, having sex even matter in a relationship? And I think that's where you're starting to go with this deeper connection, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that, intimacy in particular, when you think about intimacy, into me see, right? If you break it down phonetically, into me see, really is the space of being able to allow yourself to really open your heart to somebody and to have a very, very deep connection at a level that most people don't have with other people, except for maybe our children, right? There's often a lot of intimacy and connection with your kids before they're teenagers. But, certainly, right? Certainly.
Please understand, we're not talking about you're not having sex with your kids. That's a whole different thing.
No,
That's not what we're talking about.
No, really. But this is just a very, very deep level of connection. And when we really fully open ourselves up to our sexuality and to our partner, we are at our most vulnerable. When you are, spread eagle across the bed and having orgasms, there is hardly anything more vulnerable than that. than, maybe childbirth. I'm just thinking about from a woman's perspective, right? But it's a very, very vulnerable place to be. And it's a very deeply connected place to be. And sex is, I think, really sex and intimacy. And, some couples are fine not having like PIV sex, meaning penis in vagina sex, which often can't happen because there's a physical limitation or a disability, or sometimes as couples age, it's harder to have PIV sex. But A, it doesn't mean that you can't be sexual, and B, it also doesn't mean that there shouldn't and can't be intimacy, because you can have intimacy without sexuality, right? Without having, PIV sex. But the intimacy piece is really the key that keeps couples connected. I've seen, and I know you have too, like I've seen couples who aren't having sex, but they come in pretty good shape because they're still cuddling, they're still touching, they're still holding each other at night. They still have that intimate connection. And then we just need to work on the sexual piece. But what often happens, which is what happened in my own 26-year-old marriage, is once the sex stops altogether, right, for whatever reason, then the intimacy often starts falling apart as well. And then there's just a much, much wider gap between the two partners that makes it harder for them to come back to sex and intimacy.
I'm so glad that you're talking about sex and intimacy being a little bit different, because I have always said that Christopher Reeve and his wife, Dana, were still intimate even after he had that horrible accident. You could tell by the way that they interacted with each other. And he was paralyzed from the, from the upper chest down. So they could not engage in regular sex. But you could still tell by the way they interacted with each other. And, so people get caught up in the sex act itself versus what's behind it. And I think that's where, because one of the things is it's easy to quantify sex. You can know when you last had it versus these other things that are part and parcel of it, right? Not just the act itself, but everything that's involved with it, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think I like to talk about, we have to redefine what sex is. And that's a big piece. Like I said, most people think sex is penis and vagina. Right. If I had an orgasm, we had sex.
Right.
But if we're lying there and we're talking, telling each other what we'd like to do to each other without doing it, that doesn't constitute sex. I disagree with that. In my opinion, anything that creates erotic feelings for either partner is basically having a sexual experience, right? And if we can really redefine sex, it provides the gourmet table becomes like, there's so many more options on the table. And then we can feel less pressure about having to have intercourse, right? Because that's not something we feel like doing right now, or our bodies can't do that right now. And so that's a huge thing. If couples can really rework what it means to have sex, that will really help them feel like they're having more of a sexual relationship, right, even if they're not having PE sex.
Right. And I kind of like the idea of expanding sex into the intimacy realm instead of taking intimacy and trying to shove it into this rigid definition of sex. And it's the intimacy that creates the connection that we want. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Intimacy is the piece that really, for a lot of people, makes sex more than just juicy. It makes it deep. It makes our heart expand. Right. And I think that's what intimacy is about really being in a place where you can truly open your heart, even though it might be painful to open your heart to another person at a very, very deep level and reveal things about yourself that we don't normally reveal.
Absolutely. So this is Happily Ever After is Just the Beginning on webtalkradio.net. I'm Leslie Dories, and I'm talking intimacy and sex with Janae Paulette, intimacy coach and author of Living an Orgasmic Life, Heal Yourself and Awaken Your Pleasure. And at the risk of too much information, my own marriage has not been immune from intimacy challenges, so I get it. It's a really personal subject that couples often don't even talk to each other about, let alone anyone else. But intimacy, physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, you name it, is an innate need for humans. Yes, you and your spouse probably have different levels of desire, and that's normal. What's not is living in deprivation. So if you would like to improve this aspect of your relationship, I can help. Send me an email or give me a call and schedule your Create Your Happily Ever After strategy session. You can reach me at area code 919-924-0463. Again, that's 919-924-0463. Or you can send me an email to Leslie, Lesli, at foundationscoachingnz.com. That's FOUNDATIONS, coaching, N as in Nancy, C as in Charlie.com. And now I want to get back to this really important conversation with Janae. So in your book, which I highly recommend people get and read, you talk about something called the sexual blueprint. What is this and why is it important?
Yeah, so I think the sexual blueprint is critically important for us to understand. And we all have a sexual blueprint. Our sexual blueprint is really based on the messages that we received about sex growing up as children from our parents, from religious institutions. A lot of us have gotten, brainwashed by various religious institutions, by cultural institutions. So the messages that we received, as well as early and initial sexual experiences. So the experiences, early childhood sexual experiences with exploring our bodies, and possibly shame that might be associated with that, as well as early childhood, first sexual experiences, first or secondary sexual experiences, like how that formed in our body. But most of it is from early childhood, just like so much of what happens as adults were imprinted in us as children. And it's not just the messages we received, but also how sexuality was modeled by your parents. Did they?
Oh, Janae, our parents never had sex. Come on.
Never. Right. Mine definitely did.
Only as many children as in our family did our parents have sex.
Right. Sexuality and intimacy, both of that. And I hear that a lot, not just from the sexuality piece, but like I never saw my parents hold hands. Or as a child, I was never hugged. I was never touched. Well, how does that impact us as an adult? It makes touch something that's uncomfortable for us. Right? And so all of these messages combine to form our imprint around how we view sex as an adult, and then how that plays out in our adult sexuality. So sexual blueprints are really important. And the more you understand your sexual blueprint, and often it's discomfort and shame associated with, and very often, frequently also trauma. So obviously if there's been sexual abuse, physical abuse, of any type, that also impacts your sexual blueprint, your feeling of safety, of trust of the opposite sex, or possibly even the same sex, right? All of that really affects our sexuality and our intimacy.
Yeah, and again, this is where I spend a lot of time working with my clients about what happened to them as children, and a lot of time, and again, it isn't necessarily any kind of trauma. It's just the inputs that they get, the messages that they get, and the messages aren't necessarily factually accurate because our memories are not, are not little video cameras. But it's what we take away from those messages. And right now at least probably since you and I were children, there's been a lot more overt sexuality. Because back in the day, it was like, you go back to I Love Lucy and they couldn't sleep in the same bed, or that was like, if you had a couple in the same room, at least one of them had to have at least 1 foot on the floor. There were some really archaic kind of things going on. But now with the internet and the easy access to pornography and easy access to just again what we were talking about, sexuality being used in advertising, I think there's a lot of mixed messages. There's a lot of confusion, and and again we do the Facebook whatever about, oh, these people are, these people, their lives are fantastic. It's like, no, nobody's being honest on the internet. It's craziness. So we end up with these weird, or potentially, maybe weird is not the right word, but maybe distorted's a better word, ideas about what's normal. Or like you said, we might have been shamed as children. I remember there was a little boy who lived across the street from me. We were 2 weeks apart, and doing the playing doctor kind of thing when we were probably 5. Mm-hmm. Which is like, oh, people are like freaking out. But kids are curious.
Yeah, kids are really curious, but, don't underestimate. It just happened with a client I was working with. Don't underestimate the impact of that being caught playing doctor with a friend, right? Don't ever underestimate the impact that has on how we view sexuality, like our feeling like bodies are not discoverable. Mm-hmm. And it's nasty or naughty to touch your own body. Well, that impacts our desire, our ability, our comfort with giving ourselves pleasure, right? And could affect our ability of giving a partner pleasure or being able to receive pleasure as well.
Well, and I think that second one, being able to receive pleasure, because if we're, and I've known you for a long time, and we've talked about this a lot, that if you don't know what feels good to you, how can your partner do it? It puts your partner at behind the 8 ball. It's like, well, if you don't know what feels good, then and again, it's that whole thing about, oh, we can't do these things because it's shameful, or nudity's bad, or you have to have this perfect body, or whatever the negative messages that we get that come from doing this sexual blueprint and understanding. And I think it's critically important to tell people it's not about judgment about how you got this message. It's more, here's the message that I've gotten. What does that mean in my current life?
Right. And also, I think it's really important because, like, when I do this exercise when we used to have workshops, I do this exercise in any of my groups or my virtual groups or whatever, and I get people to get together and talk about their sexual blueprint. What they realize very, very quickly is, like, they're not abnormal. A lot of us people feel like, oh my God, like, I can't believe I played doctor, or I kissed another girl, or you know what I'm saying? And then they talk with a group of women or men, and they're like, well, of course I did that too. I did that too. I did that too. And so the way to really help us rid ourselves of this shame and embarrassment is just to realize, like, normalizing it. And just by talking about it with other people or talking about it with your partner, right, is helps to normalize the conversation around sex. And then you're like, okay, I get it. My own shame story, which I know, you've heard a million times, is like, my little dog, when I was 7 years old, liked to lick my genitals, and it felt really good. And yet I knew that there was something bad about it. And it really made me have a lot of anxiety around sex, and especially around oral sex. And it took me a long time to figure out that connection. I could never have an orgasm during oral sex because my body was in this contracted place, waiting for my mother to come in the room, which, by the way, she never did come in the room. But she was up there on the second floor, and I knew she was nearby. So, my little body knew that this was something, quote, knew that there was something wrong, right? And so the anxiety just comes in. And that's what happens, right? That's the road that we start, going down. And when we start talking about, like when I first said this at a meeting, and it took me like 15 minutes to be able to actually admit this, right? 2 other people came up to me and said, like, yeah, I did something like that too. And I'm like, really?
Right. Well, and I think that this is, we're talking about sex and intimacy, but I think this is true about anything. We think we're the only ones, whatever it is. And, imposter syndrome or sex issues or whatever it is, we all think we're the only one, and other people are going, what are you talking about? I have this too, and again, this is that thing about talking about it. So I want to ask, obviously, one of the things that will help that couples do to improve this aspect of the relationship is to be able to talk about this. But how can they start? Because again, this is, and as I said before, when I talk to my clients, I say, don't have this conversation in the bedroom while you're trying to have sex, because that will talk about putting pressure on people. That will do it. Right. But how can people who, just as society, we don't talk about this very much. And sex is so personal, right?
Right.
And even though we all have the same parts, they all aren't exactly in the same place or put together in quite exactly the same way. So what worked with one person may not work with the person that you're with. So how can couples start talking about this in a way that people's feelings don't get hurt? I know that's one of the things that it's really hard.
Yeah. So, there's a couple of pieces. There's like talking about your sexual blueprint, which is like, a dedicated conversation. Hey, like, I just read this interesting article that this woman, Janae, wrote about sexual blueprint. Let's talk about it. I've never really there's that, right? Just starting to have that conversation. But in terms of like, one of the exercises that I like to give my couples to do is to, I call it an R&D night, a research and development night. And, I'm like, okay, so you're just like research and development scientists. Put your beginner hat on, make believe that you don't really know this person's body, and just have a time to explore. No expectations of sex, no expectations of orgasm. Just like, okay, like, let's just kind of just go back to being like those kids when we were playing doctor when we were 6 years old, and just start exploring. Oh, wow. Okay. Like, if I touch you over here, like, do you like that? Do you want more pressure? Just beginning to explore. And so many couples need to go back to that because they get into a routine. Like, this is the routine in which we have sex,
It's Tuesday night, nudge, 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 right?
Right. Whatever. I touch her breast, she might kiss me, then I go down on her, then we have sex, right? That's it. We have our routine, which also gets really boring, which is how people lose desire, because it's like, well, the same thing's going to happen time and time again. And, if you do anything too many times,
right. Yeah.
we get bored, and women especially get bored. So having the opportunity to do, A, just to do something different, and B, just to take the charge off of it. Right? And just to take the charge off it and say, let's just have a fun night. Let's have a fun night. Let's not have any expectations. And let's just go back to being beginner's mind and see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful because, again, if you're with somebody for a long time, there's this habit that people get into of, I know this person. And one of the things that's always a real challenge is that because of women's hormonal changes, both through the month and then also through the years, what worked last week may not work today. And I can understand, and a lot of men get very frustrated, and I understand that. But I'm going to tell you, the women get frustrated too. It's not a one or the other, because I think a lot of just what happens physiologically gets downplayed. And then, of course, I remember there's a cartoon called Baby Blues. And years ago, there was one of the cartoons was, the husband's reading this thing, this article, and it says here that the average couple has sex, 3.2 times a week. And the woman going, okay, is that newly married couples with a baby? I mean, she's like going, who are these people? And that's so true, because, and in a way, I think I know what you're going to say, but, because that can be, oh, here's an opportunity to do something new, versus, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing here, because what worked before isn't working now. So how can I guess that's part of the conversation couples need to have, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first of all, what happened, it's not only just what happened last week may not be the same. It's like what happened yesterday morning may not be the same as, and that is mostly a female thing. And I don't know how much of it honestly is hormones. I mean, certainly hormones will affect our desire, but I think that women are just wired, our bodies are just, wired. And I think it's more like a nerve ending kind of thing. And women need a lot of different stimulation. There's really good research that's come out recently around how women's desire is very much related to having different things happening all the time, because we really do get bored sexually. Men don't. Men generally are pretty okay. Like, we just do the missionary position 2 times a week. I'm good with that. Like, they really don't have, most of them, a little generalization, but they,
right,
from a research perspective, they're really more used to and okay with doing the same thing. And it's not true for women. And that's a huge piece around women's desire and lack thereof of desire. Mm-hmm. So being really creative and trying new things, stretching yourselves, in as many directions as you can stretch. Sometimes it's even like, let's have sex in the living room, or let's have sex in the bathroom, mm-hmm. right? Just even changing the location can create some excitement and some desire. And in long-term relationships, really long-term relationships like yours, right? Like, you really need to make it a priority, and you need to really focus on it. Mm-hmm. And you need to create all of these different, ways in which sex can happen that's fun and exciting and interesting and different. And you need to know more about like what your desires are, which is probably another podcast. We could talk another podcast about core desires. But I mean, that's just right. A really big piece of really understanding that, we need variety. Women need variety in sex. We need to understand that. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to create that and plan for it.
And it's the planning for it that I think is a part that gets lost in the busy, and maybe that's why people aren't having as much sex, is because and sex needs not to be looked at like as a chore, because again, please, nobody, it's like, okay. But it's this idea.
A lot of people do look at, I
know.
Right? Because so many women do look at it, and men, as a chore. It's something that I have to check off my, it's on the checklist list to keep my partner happy. And then that creates resentment as well, right? And the resentment starts to make you lose your desire. So when we ask about why women are losing desire, service sex, who wants to have service sex? Even if you end up having an orgasm,
right,
and you end up having pleasure, it still isn't something that's coming from a place of desire.
Right. And so, so I think that, because I'm sitting here thinking about, a prototypical couple, because when I ask about, what is your sexual pattern? What is this? And it's usually like right before we go to bed on a weeknight, and it's kind of like, yeah, that's probably not, that's probably not going to keep it going over the long term. And I know that especially when people have children, mine are now adults, so that's, there is an end in sight, people. I do tell, they do eventually grow up, but that can be really hard. And again, part of that, shame, because my one of my kids just told me, it's like, yeah, we knew what it meant when the door was closed.
Good.
Which is like, okay, you're trying to keep it quiet, but part of it is it's I mean, yeah, you don't necessarily want your kids walking in on you, but again, going back to the sexual blueprint, is like, do you want to know that I mean, obviously on some level you don't want to know that your parents were doing that, but it's actually what normalizes it for you, I think.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I tell couples with young parents, young kids all the time, I'm like, when they're old enough to get their cereal and watch TV, A, you need to have a lock on your bedroom door, and B, you need to tell them, mommy and daddy have private time on Saturday morning. So you've got your TV, and if if it's an emergency,
right, come knock on the door, right?
Knock on the door, but mommy and daddy need to have private time. And that's an important message that kids get.
So, I mean, we could talk about this for a lot, but I do think that it's really important for people to really take a look at this aspect of their relationship, because that's part of what keeps us together. That's part of what keeps us connected. And and so where can people learn more about you? Where can they get your book and all that good stuff?
Okay, great. So I have a website. It's called Power of Pleasure, powerofpleasure.com. And on that website, I have a really great video for women on how to reclaim your desire, and my sexual blueprint is there as well. And my book, you can find information about it there or at Amazon under the name of the book, which is Living an Orgasmic Life.
Okay. So what I want people to know is, no, marriage does not have to be the place where sex goes to die. But like a lot of things, it will suffer if it isn't made a priority. And intimacy of all kinds is key to your marriage's health, and touch is actually critical for your emotional health. And sex could be a great way to increase connection. So my question is, what would help you deal with whatever is getting in your way? And hopefully you found some really good answers on this program. And until next week, stay loving.